As many? Assuming this is a wrap-up, the chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I, through you, thank honourable members for an interesting and illuminating debate on this subject, which confirms the view that I have, that there is this national ambivalence on the question of immigration, which is reflected in all of the interventions which were made here today. Nothing that was said convinces me that we have made the wrong decision. But what I think is even more right than the decision to, in its effect, that is, to bring the legislation forward, is the fact that we're able to illuminate the discussion by this debate here and put all the views which the Bahamian public, I'm sure, many people have deeply felt views on this subject, and I think they can thank all of their representatives for having advanced their views in this forum today. I tried to remember the name, the words of this song, but they couldn't tell me all of the lyrics. I think I remember them, though. It goes something like, never interfere with man and wife. You never understand. You never know whether they're wrong or right. Just show your sympathy. And I think that goes back to my other starting point about this business of a morganatic marriage and the philosophical position that man and wife ought to be equal. And we want to do our best to facilitate that by bringing this amendment forward. And the issues are difficult on both sides. I said in my first intervention that Bahamians on a macro level are all for Bahamianization and for stopping foreigners from taking over their country. But on a micro level, each individual wants to have their work permit for the individual they want to work for them. And similarly, we can make general comments about the problems of marriages of convenience and whether people are actually being are married for the right reasons and all the rest of it. But that's on the macro level. What happens, and ministers of immigration, I'm sure, have all run into this problem, and members of parliament, when an individual woman is aggrieved because she has applied for her husband to get permission to stay in the country and has not heard 6 months, 1 year, 2 years after the fact, and that person is in limbo and has to ask, disgracefully so, has to ask the Director of Immigration to write a letter so their spouse can enter the Bahamas or leave the Bahamas and come back. And we know that those are all, that people run afoul of the bureaucracy all the time, and there's a need to correct it. And this is one of the ways we can do so. And of course you have the other side, where some men or women come and complain that you need to take away the permit because the husband or wife is acting disgracefully. But that's all part of it, and I think you can meet these individual cases by the policies and administration of the Act itself. But what we seek to do is to provide an enabling power. In other words, right now it is not possible to give anything other than the 5 years. And after the 5 years is up, that's it. If the person doesn't get another status, he has to either be granted a work permit, which costs $1,000, and so here you are, when involuntary servitude has been abolished by our Constitution, as a husband getting a work permit for your wife for $1,000 a year. Seems to me something unseemly or wrong about that. And when you come to a parliament, you know, I was thinking that, I think one of our colleagues, it may have been the leader of the House, who said to one of our colleagues how long it actually took for me to get to the position I now have. And you remember a generation's worth of battles simply to become a minister of the government of the Bahamas. and how much time that took, and how much effort, and what it takes to move legislation and to get your ideas into the public arena. So I've always said to myself, and I think my colleagues share in this, that when you get this opportunity to do it, you try and do what you can so that the next person doesn't have to go through that again. And so all we're saying in this case is that we brought this piece of legislation because we have this rare moment to bring this piece of legislation. And any future minister can, if he wishes to, can contract the period, can expand the period, can add regulations. If the policies of the next government, whichever government that is, they want that to be different, they can do so. But the power is in the legislation to grant up to an indefinite period for someone who is a spouse of a Bahamian. We happen to feel that that is an appropriate period for someone whose marriage subsists, and that is the right thing to do. Another administration might feel that they want to put regulations to do something different. I indicated to my colleagues and to the Right Honourable Member for Centerville that the National Insurance Board, for example, or the Ministry of Finance, both institutions pay pensions to people. And occasionally, I think every year or every 2 years, they require, even though they put the money in your bank account, they require you to physically appear at the Ministry of Finance or the National Insurance Board and physically collect the check. And if you don't do that, they cease the check. So there are systems that you could put in place to check. And one of the things a minister might think about under the regulations, I think Section 47 permits regulations to be done to enable the act, is to say, for example, not that the permission lapses, but that a certificate is issued to you, and every 5 years or so, you and your spouse have to come back to the Department of Immigration and collect a fresh certificate, which then gives the opportunity for those who are concerned about this as an issue to actually physically check whether the marriage subsists. That's certainly one possibility. But I think that, you know, I remembered as the members opposite were speaking, and I thank the member Palmer for Kalani for the reasonableness of the suggestion. I think it's certainly something that should be taken up. We're certainly thinking in terms of with the trade minister of something on the financial services side as well to try and facilitate speeding up various processes. So I just think that it is important for us to move the process along, to have these various checks and balances, the one I suggested, that could be done under the regulations, and to make it possible just by these incremental steps that we are taking to make it better than it was before. I do not intend as a minister, and nor do I think it's appropriate. That's why I agree with the member for Seabreeze, that I'm supposed to, or that immigration officials are supposed to go around with a microscope inspecting people's homes. I think that's unseemly as well. All that needs to happen is that you need to make an application to the Department of Immigration. The checks will be made to see whether you are married or not, that the marriage subsists. And I think that if you are someone's husband or wife, you're supposed to have the right to live in the Bahamas and to have gainful occupation. And I don't think that the state ought to be interfering with that in any which way. That's a matter, in my view, of entirely personal choice and personal law. And the state has no business getting in it. And really we should facilitate that for citizens of the country. I think that's important. I was somewhat taken aback. I know I could not have gotten up here and made such a statement when the Member of Parliament for Long Island got up and said, I'm going to try and put it in my words, but this is the way it came off, that we must be concerned that Bahamian women are going to be so gullible that they will be swept off their feet by this horde of foreign men who are going to descend into the Bahamas and take our women away from us. I found that an interesting... No, she didn't say it in those words. I'm using exaggeration to make a point. But the point she did make was precisely that fact. She said that women would be married by these foreign men, and that we have to be concerned about these marriages of convenience in that way. The Member of Parliament for Bain-Grantstown was saying that that's always the concern. No one talks about the men marrying the women. It's always the foreign men are going to come in and take the women. But I found that a curious thing for the member for Long Island to say. Because, I'm sorry? No, I mean, if I'm wrong, she'll say she didn't say it. She'll say.
Do you have a point of order? The chair recognizes the member for Long Island.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much. I would wish to correct the Member of Parliament for Fox Hill for actually imputing and putting words in my mouth. I never suggested any such thing. When I spoke, I didn't speak to women or men specifically. I spoke about the marriages that were happening. I spoke about one incident where a foreign woman had married a Bahamian man. I did not say such a thing. And if that's the way he understood it, then maybe he should have listened more carefully. And so I suggest, Mr. Speaker, that he takes those words back.
No, I don't intend.
Chair recognizes the member for Fox
I don't
Hill.
intend to take the words back. What I would say is, if she says she didn't say them, fine. I take that bit. I would say, okay. I heard her say it. I misinterpreted. Obviously, I did. But the argument is there in the public domain, and I found it curious that this argument would be in the public domain at a time when, in the public domain, we are seeking to amend the Constitution under Article 26 to extend rights on the basis that there ought to be equality between men and women on this point.
You have a point of order?
I rise
Point of
once
order.
again, Mr.
Chair
Speaker.
recognizes the member for Long
Thank you
Island.
very much. I rise once again to give clarity to the wider Bahamian public, since the member for Fox Hill still chooses to impute certain things. Mr. Speaker, if we're going to have a referendum on whether or not there's going to be equality of the genders in this Bahamas, then let that take place during that referendum. Let us not muddy the waters today with regards to what they're doing here with this particular amendment to the immigration bill. And so, Mr. Speaker, I recommend strongly that the member for Fox Hill determines if that's his opinion, he puts that forth in his argument, but do not attribute it to me. Thank you, sir.
Well, the interesting thing about
Chair
it is
recognizes
I've
the member
taken
for
care of
Fox Hill.
that a long time, but as you know, my friend George Mackey used to say, not only one woman born a crazy child. And if you could play crazy, I could play crazy too.
This is ridiculous.
Do you have a point of order?
Mr. Speaker, the
member
member for
didn't-
Parliament is using unparliamentary language in here. And if he is in fact crazy, then fine. Do not categorize me in that category with him. I accept he's crazy. But please, Mr. Speaker, I am not in that category.
The member is doing a wrap-up, and we're gonna try to get through this debate in a very civil
if
manner.
you're crazy, you'll be crazy.
Member, continue to wrap up. The member for Fox Hill, you have the floor.
Wake up and eat wasp nest for breakfast, man.
Which statements are you attributing to be retracted?
About the crazy people, and not one person, not one mother born a crazy woman. And I have suggested, Mr. Speaker, that this member is speaking to me, and so he needs to take those statements back. I am not crazy like him.
In essence,
Mr.
it's a bit convoluted to the chair, but in essence, I didn't see it to be unparliamentary.
Mr. Speaker,
The member is stating that if you are quote unquote crazy, he's also crazy. So essentially, the member for Long Island states that she's not crazy.
Yes,
Could you kindly continue?
Let me be clear. I never once said that she was crazy. She said that I'm crazy. No,
Member for Long Island. Remember, you cannot speak from your seat in that fashion.
No, I'm not asking her to withdraw. I'm not asking her to withdraw anything. No,
Member for Fox Hill.
Calm down.
Member for Fox Hill. Address the chair.
Yeah, calm down.
We had a good debate. Let's get through the debate.
Yeah, 5 more years, man. Don't worry about it. 5 years to go. 5 years to go. That's, I just wanted to quote my friend George Mackey. That's all I was doing. He said, you know, my late friend George Mackey said, not only one woman born a crazy child. And if you could play crazy, I could play crazy too. That's all I said. That's very good. But I found that argument was just, to advance that argument, yes, in this day and time just seemed incredible to me and unbelievable. So my point is, in this day and age, and in an enlightened age, 5 years. 5 years. 5 years. 5 years. 5 years. I'm just saying that argument seems to me out of place in this day and time. What I would say also, Mr. Speaker, is that the way to approach policy is to we have a
Members, wrap up. Member for Fox Hill, please.
Yeah, what we have here is a situation where we are putting in place a general policy to deal with a specific problem, and we think we've found the best way to deal with it. It gives an amplified and an enabling power to the minister, and we think it is right for this power to be vested in the minister. And so it will be, I commend it to the House. I believe that it will be good for the Bahamian public. We promise to take on board all of the matters which have been raised by members opposite. You know, and I just leave you with this, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago in a recent forum I was speaking to her about something that the opposition had done in Trinidad, opposing one of her policies. And I liked the way she responded to this philosophically. Well, opposition parties oppose. That's what they do. So we would have been surprised if today they came and said, we all join you in this joyous love fest of this policy. But what they did was made a contribution to amplifying the debate, notwithstanding the excesses of one of their members. But we move on, which we think is a good policy. We commend it to the House, and I believe that the Bahamian public will be pleased at the result. Before I sit, I would like, however, to add something I neglected to do this morning, and that is to extend condolences to the family of the late Israel Roll of West End, Grand Bahama, who is better known as Bonefish Foley, a man of great stature in the Grand Bahama and West End community. I met him when I was minister in the term 202 to 207, and his home had been damaged or destroyed during the hurricane. I forget which one it was. And John Rood was then the ambassador to the Bahamas from the United States. Hurricane Francis, the member for West End says. And John Rood, as a child, had come to the Bahamas to learn bone fishing with his father, and met Bonefish Foley during that time, and was taught a lot by him, had a great deal of affection for him. And when he went down to West End and saw the circumstances, he immediately decided that he would actually rebuild a brand new home for Mr. Roll. And that home was built, and Mr. Roll was thankful for it. We went down and had a ceremony for it. The Member of Parliament was there. And ever since that time, a great deal of affectionate bonds have built up between Mr. Roll, his family, and myself. And I was saddened. Indeed, there's a song which has been written about him, Bonefish Foley. So I want to record in this House my condolences to his family on his passing. The bill I commend to the House, and I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member, and thank all Honourable Members for a spirited and informative debate. The question is that the following bill be read a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the Immigration Act. As many are in favour will remain seated, and those opposed will stand. Ordered that the bill be read a second time and committed.
A bill for an act to amend the Immigration Act.
Further second reading of bills. The Chair recognizes the Honourable Member for Fox Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my honor to move the second of these bills today, a bill for an act to amend the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Act. And in doing so, I would like, first of all, to pay tribute at this time and to give some background to the whole issue of the whole history of and background of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The amendments are two quite simple amendments, one of which seeks to clarify the powers of the Governor General to create foreign service orders as the Governor General may consider necessary, establishing and regulating the terms and conditions of service in the Bahamas or in any other country of employees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And secondly, by the insertion immediately after paragraph B of the following new paragraph, that the Governor General may make such rules as he may consider necessary, establishing, codifying, and regulating the issuance and terms and conditions of visas for the entry of persons who are not citizens of the Bahamas or permanent residents. So that is the intention of the bill. It is, again, an enabling statute, and the details will be done in a set of regulations which we propose to bring to the House in the fall, which will first establish the foreign service orders, and these have been worked on by successive governments. There's a last set of foreign service orders which were left by the last administration. We're trying to see whether we can get them finalized and put before the House in October. And secondly, the question of visas, which I will come to in a minute. But in doing so, I'd like to first pay tribute to the previous ministers of foreign affairs of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And by my reckoning, there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, 7 including myself. The first minister responsible in those days for external affairs was the Right Honourable Sir Lyndon Pinling, followed by the Honourable Paul Adderley, followed by the Honourable Sir Clement Maynard, followed by Mr. Charles Carter, followed by Mrs. Janet Bostrick, then by myself, and just prior to me, the Honourable Brent Simonet. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs obviously did not become a ministry or a responsibility but for independence in 1973. Our external affairs up to that point were handled by the British. Indeed, I was just speaking to the Member of Parliament for Golden Gates, who was saying that he was just talking to the Honourable A.D. Hanna about how we moved up to this point of independence in 1973, when certain constitutional changes were made in the 60s, and there was an agreement between the then Bahamian government and opposition that the Bahamas government would advance to independence as soon thereafter as was possible after the 1967 general election. And instead of going in 2 stages, we actually, in 1 stage, we did it in 2 stages by, in 1969, amending the Constitution to give, to add to the responsibilities of internal self-government the responsibility for the police force, which was then still resident in the governor, and then to change the nomenclature from Premier to Prime Minister. And then in 1973, the Constitution ultimately handed over the full responsibility. External affairs was left with the British. And then in 1973, when we became independent, external affairs transferred over to the Bahamas government. And in the run-up to the election, there was a man named John Hindmarsh who acted as our High Commissioner prior to 1973, looking after our interests, knowing that in 1973 we'd have to establish an office overseas, which would be responsible for our relations with the British government and the new Bahamian government under independence. The act, which was passed in 1975, created a corporation sole, made the Minister of Foreign Affairs a corporation sole. And what that did was it gave the minister the right to sue and be sued and to enter into contracts. That becomes a practical issue because all of the properties which are owned by the country overseas are vested in the Minister of Foreign Affairs as a corporation sole. We own properties, the building in London, the Chancery, and the residence of the ambassador. We own a building in Atlanta. We own a building in Washington. We own a building in New York. And we believe that that we ought to, given the longevity of our presence in Miami, it is perhaps a good idea to find some residence in Miami as well. But those are owned by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs, of course, is a corporation, but that corporation is owned by the government of the Bahamas. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs is, in fact, an agent of the government of the Bahamas. It was interesting for me on the passing of the late George Stewart, who was a retired Foreign Affairs Director General, that Pericles Melis, who was an employee of the Attorney General's office at the time of independence, said during Mr. Stewart's funeral what an interesting experience it was trying to build the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the very beginning in 1973. He said the mythology, my words, not his, is that the British had this very smooth transition process from them over to us at independence. But in fact, the country had to start from scratch, at least in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs side, because there were no procedures. Everything had to be built up from scratch, and people had to go and learn from various sources what to do. And when I come to discuss the issue of visas, that is still the basis upon which visas are granted today. An agglomeration of rules and policy decisions made over time, some of which were inherited from the British, that simply form the basis of doing so. And we simply believe that this is not a transparent basis to be running a modern visa issuance service, that you need, in fact, to have a service which people know the rules, know how to apply, know what the costs are, and to give you a reason for whether your visa is rejected or accepted. I subject to Ministry of Finance, these early pioneers like Pericles Melis, George Stewart, Ernest Strawn, who was the head of the Protocol Division, Paul Adley as the minister, all worked to try and build up what we have today as a modern into a modern forest service. And one of the additional building blocks we need is a separate Foreign Service career path for Foreign Service orders, for Foreign Service officers. Because right now what is happening is there's a confusion between these public service ranks and the ranks which diplomats must have when they go overseas. And there's been some attempt to match them up so that, for example, the First Assistant Secretary, whether that is the equivalent of a Minister Counselor or whether it's a deputy, whether a deputy permanent secretary is equivalent to a deputy chief of mission, and whereas ambassadorial rank and so on and so forth. So what happens is most countries have a separate foreign service in which all of these ranks are delineated, and you know what you have to do to qualify for those ranks, and it also tells you how long you serve overseas, how long you're in post, what goes with the post when you take the post, and how you can qualify for promotions, and what are the basic qualifications for entering the service. Right now, Foreign Service officers apply. Most of them enter as trainee administrative cadets with a bachelor's degree, and then they have a 2-year period of rotation within the country, and at the end of 2 years are posted overseas. I happen to feel that that's too long an incubation period, and really you need some shorter and more truncated period. But it is things like that which need to be put on a transparent basis so that the people who form the Foreign Service can in fact know what it is they have to meet in order to advance in the Foreign Service. But most Bahamians, Mr. Speaker, generally do not think of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as having any relevancy to their life or daily existence, except when a passport expires or their U.S. visa is rejected at the embassy here in Nassau. And then Bahamians come to the ministry because they expect that we can certainly deal with the issue of passports because the passports are issued by us. The more problematic issue is the question of U.S. visas. The other issue is that of arrests abroad. What, in fact, assistance can the country offer to people who are arrested or run into some trouble abroad? For example, medical expenses, or you run out of money when you are overseas and you have no other way to get back home. So in certain circumstances, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is actually the first entity that you turn to if there's some emergency when no one else can assist. But it's important to note that when people make decisions to travel overseas, these are personal, private decisions which are made on a contractual basis with the various carriers. And so it is actually your first responsibility to take your expenses, whether emergencies or not, if you happen to run into problems overseas. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a kind of backstop for when people run into problems overseas. And one of the things that we often have to explain is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as presently constituted, does not provide lawyers for people who run into problems overseas. That there has to be a special sort of application for that to be done. And I think the last administration did exercise such a special application in the case of some individuals who ran into problems up in New York. But generally speaking, it is the person's individual responsibility to deal with their legal problems. What is the responsibility of the ministry is if the person asks for consular assistance, which means that if you contact the embassy, you say, I need someone to get in touch with my family, I need you to visit me to see that I'm okay, that is a responsibility they have. And I said here that philosophically, our view is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has the responsibility to, or our mission is to ensure that Bahamians, as they move around the world, have a seamless experience crossing border to border. And that means whether for travel, travel for tourism, or travel for business or official reasons. So we do our best with the limited resources that we have. I would like to say that in connection with this visa issue, that last week during my visit to Washington to give the official response of the Bahamas government to the matters relating to the OAS report on the general elections, that I did in fact raise the issue of what we consider to be anecdotal, not statistical evidence of an increasing number of complaints from Bahamian citizens of U.S. visas being rejected by Bahamian applicants on a basis that seems other than reasonable or fair. We raised the matter here with the local embassy, raised the matter in Washington. And there's a particular provision in American law, it's section 214B of their act, which is a provision which indicates that you have not established that you have sufficient ties to the country that you're in order for them to grant the visa. And this has been increasingly turning up as a complaint to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We've asked the embassy here to investigate this matter because the other matter that people are complaining about is the way people are spoken to when they apply at the embassy, and they promised, in fact, to investigate these issues. And so I just wanted Bahamians to know that these are matters that we're seeking to address in a general way because of the increasing nature of the complaints on this matter. In addition, I'm sorry? I'm going to come to the airport as well. In addition, we have also raised with them the matter of the processing through the pre-clearance facility here at the Lyndon Pindling International Airport. A few weeks ago, I was approached by a representative of one of the commercial airliners who complained that they were routinely missing their departures by sometimes as much as 2 hours because the people being processed through the pre-clearance lounge was simply so long delayed. And we are told that some passengers going through the facility have in fact been furious at it. The commercial airliners have said that they are in fact losing money as a result of their schedules being slipped. And so this, of course, immediately becomes a matter of concern for us. So again, I want to say both to the traveling public that comes and uses the Lyndon Pindling International Airport and the Bahamian traveling public, the international traveling public and the Bahamian traveling public, that this is a matter with which we are au fait, and that we have in fact brought it to their attention. They've indicated that they have staffing issues which have to be resolved, and that in the short term it does not appear that they'll be able to address it because they simply don't have the manpower to meet the demands in the facility here. But we've nevertheless asked them both at this level here in Nassau and at the level in Washington to see if this is a matter which they can address with some urgency, because it is a matter of some concern to us and to our traveling public. And the other point I would wish to raise is that we expect shortly an ambassador to come to the Bahamas, I believe on the 13th of August, and that ambassador will be meeting with the Trafficking in Persons Committee, which is headed by Missouri Sherman Peter, a retired permanent secretary. You members may recall that the Bahamas was put on a watch list by the United States under these one of these laws in the U.S. which monitors the progress of countries on various aspects of, in some cases, narcotics, other cases, human rights, and this one is about trafficking in persons. And trafficking in persons is not to be confused in law with smuggling, human smuggling, which is a different issue. Trafficking in persons has to do with the movement of people around the country, around the world, or across borders under duress for sexual reasons. And this is a matter which the United States has taken the position that the country has not done sufficient to get off this second tier, and there's some implications if you can only be on it until advised for 2 years. This would be the third year coming up. And the result is that there are certain decisions, if we are unable to get off this list, that will result in sanctions like the United States can, in the international financing agencies, block certain loans to the Bahamas. So this would be a matter of concern, since the major lender for the Bahamas government is in development assistance is the IDB. So we're quite concerned about it as an issue. The ambassador is coming, and we are hoping that during the course of those talks we can together determine how we can deal with this matter before the next report is issued. So I'd wish to flag that for the Bahamian public. Mr. Speaker, As I said, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was formally established by legislation in 1975, and it outlines the functions of the ministry. The main function is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is to be the point of communication between foreign governments and the government of the Bahamas. And so that is its main mission and goal. And the First Amendment deals with Foreign Service orders. I've explained what those Foreign Service orders are, and that we have proposed, again, to put those before this House so that the House can see what we propose to do, and perhaps have a period of comment before they're actually brought into force. And, of course, they have to be circulated amongst the employees. One of the issues that we're trying to resolve now is the employer, in my view, and this is subject to our colleagues' position, and the draft will say, is going to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The employer at the moment for Foreign Service officers is the Public Service Commission. It seems to me it would be self-defeating if all we do is put in place Foreign Service orders that are then applied by the Public Service Commission. So I'm having them looked at again with a view to seeing how they ought to be amended so that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as the corporation sole, becomes the employer. If that is accepted by the lawyers, what would need to happen is a transition provision would have to be put in place, because this would be a change in the material terms and conditions for employees of the ministry. And the way this has been done in the past is similar to when the PHA legislation was passed, where there's a 2-year transition provision where people have a choice on whether they want to sign over to the ministry or whether they wish to remain with the public service. And so that's what I'm thinking ought to happen. And that is the last kind of tweaking that we're doing at the moment. I'd wish to pay a tribute to the Foreign Service officers who are part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the excellent job which they do in serving our country both home and abroad. And I should also add, since I did not have the time to do so during the earlier presentation, that a similar yeoman service is actually done by the people who form the Immigration Department, the immigration officers who work on a daily basis, sometime in arduous and dangerous conditions. I spoke recently to the head of our enforcement unit because it's an undermanned and understaffed department, and few people realize that it's almost like the police force, because it has to go out at all hours of the night. There was a call, for example, about 2 weeks ago of a boat that washed up on the shores of, I guess that's the southern shores of Exuma, and everybody had scattered to the wind. They could find nobody. So together, the boat made it all the way there, and the enforcement unit of immigration and the Royal Bahamas Police Force and Defense Force formed a joint task force, went down to Exuma, and they were able to find, by going through the community, 45 of the individuals who they suspected were illegal migrants on the boat. So this is a real tough job. And so I want to thank them and thank all the director and all the officers who work with them, as I thank the Foreign Service officers for all the work which they do on our behalf. Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas now has an e-visa issuance system. It's an online system for the processing of visa applications. And prior to being enrolled, the sponsors interviewed and supporting documents are received by a visa officer. And then all of the steps are taken to ensure that, that enrollment is done properly. Visa identification numbers then generated, and of course the visa ultimately ends up in the passport. What I hope is, both in the case of the issuance of passports and in the case of the issuance of visas, that the next generation of equipment makes it possible for people to apply for all of these processes online directly. Right now, even though you can fill the paperwork out online, in fact, it's still a paper-intensive system, and it seems to me to leave too much room for error, and there are too many mechanical parts with files going missing and all the like. So I'm hoping one day that we can actually move to a situation where you apply, and then you can actually get the answer. For example, if you apply for a visa for Australia, it's all done online, and it's all issued online if you meet the criteria. To do that, you have to have something which is transparent in terms of what is required in order to get a visa. And we don't now have any of those procedures. For example, you cannot, I mean, there's some general information which you can find on the government's website, but you cannot find, and nor can a consular officer find in one place, what are the rules and regulations with regard to the issuance of visas. So what we're trying to do by this enabling legislation is to put regulations in place so that everybody will know how visas are issued. And one of the more troubling things for me, coming as I have from a kind of human rights background, was a decision that was made which still stands, that there is a moratorium on granting visas to Haitians. Now, it seems to me that something's not quite right with that, because how do you isolate one nationality and say that they can't get visas except under certain circumstances, when in fact what you ought to have is a rule which has general applicability to all nationalities, and you either meet the test or you don't meet the test. Now, I think this was put in place as a mechanism to stop illegal migration. Well, obviously, that doesn't work, because people who come here certainly don't ask for visas when they get on the boat out of the north of Haiti. So enforcement is one issue about stopping the illegal migration. But I think these policies all need to be rationalized, transparent, be fair, non-discriminatory for all applicants who are applying for visas to come to the Bahamas. And also that the length of time it takes for visas should be shortened considerably by putting this on a more transparent basis. And hopefully it will stop, and I said to a colleague here who was a former Minister of Immigration, that one of the things I've learned about this job is that everywhere you go as a Minister of Immigration, and this is certainly true as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, because you're the ultimate decider, if that's a word, that's a Bushism, that if you're actually deciding these things, everyone's walking up to you with a piece of paper in their hand saying, I need a visa, I need a work permit, so on and so forth. And I think you can't really make decisions on that. I mean, routinely what I say is that these things have to go to the officials because that's the process. So I'm not trying to be offensive to anybody. I'm just saying the process is you have to apply through the officials for visas and work permits and let the thing come up through the system. Otherwise, I think you're begging for problems. We all are. So that is the reason why we brought these two amendments to be able, first of all, to improve the terms and conditions and the transparency with which Foreign Service offices operate in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, both at home and abroad. And secondly, to be able to put the issuance of visas on a more open, fair, transparent, and rational basis. And I would once again pay homage and tribute to all my predecessors. I'll name them again. Sir Lyndon Pinling, the Honourable Paul Adley, Sir Clement Maynard, Mr. Charles Carter, Mrs. Janet Bostwick, and Mr. Brent Simonet. And I thank you very much.